نحمي الأقصى رمب بيخسى لا يظلم الأمريكان إيدي بإيدك نحمي الأقصى من فرعون ومن هامان حكم ترامب بقدسي يخسى لا يظلم الأمريكان إيدي بإيدك نحمي الأقصى من فرعون ومن هامان حكم ترامب بقدسي يخسى لا يظلم الأمريكان.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Azra Banu, and a very good evening to you, Professor Dr. Saul Takahashi, all the way from Osaka. How is life with COVID-19?
Well, actually, things are pretty relaxed here, believe it or not. We've never had a really very enforced mandatory lockdown. So life is slow and not quite up to normal, but compared to some other countries, including Malaysia, we've actually had it pretty easy, I have to say.
All right, and I must say that life is returning not to normal, but we're getting there over here in Malaysia, which is something of a relief to everyone here. So, Professor Dr. Saul, without much delay, we're going to talk about the current very, very hot issue, annexation of Palestine. But just before we begin, I want to just give a brief introduction to our listeners out there. Now, Professor Dr. Saul Takahashi is Professor of Human Rights and Peace Studies in Osaka Joaquin University. You are also the Deputy Head of Office Occupied Palestine of the UNHCR. And you were with Amnesty.
I'm not anymore, but I was.
Yeah, you were. Yeah, and you were also with Amnesty International. And the very first question I have for you is, what were you doing when you were in Palestine?
Well, I was recruited as the Deputy Head of Office for OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So that's basically the UN Human Rights Agency. And I was working as the Deputy Head of Office in the Palestine office from 2009 to 2014. They recruited me really to help with strengthening the monitoring operations, which basically is the operation that when we hear of human rights violations having taken place, which is of course every day, we would go and we would document it. We would talk to witnesses, talk to victims, get together reports. We submitted regular reports to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva and to the General Assembly in New York. We were lobbying the Israeli government for improvement. That was the kind of thing that I was doing. I was there for 5 years, from 2009 to 2014. It was a very, very in-depth experience and very in-depth introduction into the question of human rights in Palestine, for sure. I lived in Jerusalem. My office was in Ramallah, but we had offices all over Palestine. So I went to Hebron quite a lot. I went to Gaza pretty frequently. I went to Nablus all the time. I was doing a lot of traveling all over the place. So it was a very in-depth introduction as to what was going on.
And that was for 5 years, 2009 to 2014?
Yes, it was right after Operation Cast Lead in Gaza that the Human Rights Council decided that the UN should strengthen the monitoring operations, so strengthen the documentation of human rights violations in Palestine. So that's when they recruited me, and that's when I was posted in Palestine. And I left in 2014 at the end of May. So it was right before the next major military offensive against Gaza. Very sort of coincidental that I was sort of sandwiched in between those big operations. And I left the UN in 2014. That's when I left. I came back to Japan and I did all sorts of other stuff and started teaching, basically. It was a great experience, and working in Palestine was wonderful in all sorts of different ways. But of course, being in the UN means that you're very constrained from what you can say publicly. You're a civil servant, and that's how it is. You always have to maintain the appearance of strict neutrality and strict impartiality. And that's one of the things which I don't have to do now because I'm not with the UN. So I can give you a very direct and very off the cuff account as to what is going on there.
All right, which brings us
Inshallah.
right to this topic, right? Annexation. We've been hearing so much about this most of this year. And many people out there still, we still don't know the extent of it, right? We don't really know what it's about. So what is this whole issue about annexation?
Sure. Annexation, I mean, everybody knows, I think, the definition of annexation, which is that land that you are occupying, a country announces that that land is formally part of its own country now. It's going to be treated as part of its own country. Its domestic laws will be applied there, and it will, for all purposes, it will be part of that country. Now, just to sort of help with this explanation, I do have one slide. I'm not going to have this long presentation, don't worry, everybody, but I just do have one slide, which I hope will be, oh dear, it doesn't look like I can share my slide. I'm not sure how, could you, I don't know if there's some kind of setting that you could do that makes it possible.
Yeah.
I think if,
in the meantime,
right.
yeah, so.
Oh, okay, now I'm a co-host, so it should work.
Okay.
Right, okay. So let's just do this. I know everybody's been using Zoom a 1,000 times. Or, let's see, right. So anybody who's really looked into the whole issue of Palestine has seen these 4 maps in all sorts of different colors and all sorts of different forms. But I do think it's always very helpful to really sort of start from the basics. I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the history, but I do want to, this is helpful in sort of showing everybody what exactly we're talking about right now. I'm not going to go through each map right now because actually I think we can come back to them, especially the one on the far left and the second one from the far left. So the 2 on the left, these have to do with the UN partition plan and 1948 or pre-1948, and that's very important. So I'd like to come back to those later if that's okay. But
yes.
Right now I just want to show, I want to show everybody what we're talking about when we're talking about annexation. So if you look at the map, the second one from the right, and if you look at the white land, the white part, this is mandate Palestine. This is historical Palestine. And the white land is basic. This is how what the situation looked like in 1948, after the 1948 war. So Israel unilaterally declared independence in 1948 as soon as the British left. Then there was a war with some neighboring countries, Arab countries, and of course the Israelis won hands down. So at the end of that war, this is what the situation looked like. The white part was basically occupied by the Israelis. This is what the Israelis declared as their country. And it's never been completely, these borders have never been completely formally recognized by anybody really, but it's more or less accepted internationally that this white part here, this is what the state of Israel looks like. In the UN, we used to call the white part Israel proper, quote unquote. So this is, from the perspective of the international community, this is what, this is not Palestine anymore. This is Israel. Now I have my own opinions about that, and we're going to come back to that. But I want to sort of get that off at the start to sort of explain what we're talking about. Now the green part in the same map, this was still not taken by the Israelis. The West Bank on the right part of Palestine, and this includes East Jerusalem. The green part there, the West Bank, was occupied by Jordan. And the little part here in Gaza, down at the bottom left, this was occupied by Egypt. So in 1948, this had still not been taken by the Israelis. From the very beginning, from the very end of the 1948 war, as a matter of fact, during the 1948 war, Israeli military and political leaders were already talking about how they could take this land, especially the eastern part of Jerusalem, which has the old city and all the, all the holy sites, all the holy religious sites. So they had their eyes on this from the very beginning. But in any case, they had to wait until 1967 and the Six-Day War, once again with the neighboring Arab countries, to take it. So in 1967, they took the, we're still looking at the same map now, the second one from the right. They took these two parts, Gaza and the West Bank. Now they have been occupying this land since 1967. And this is the part that the international community basically recognizes as Palestine. This is the part that everybody in the UN and international diplomacy, all the other countries essentially recognize this is going to be what, give or take a little bit, this is going to be what any kind of independent Palestinian state is going to look like. Now, ever since the Israelis took this land in 1967, maybe what I'll do is I will stop looking at the slide so everybody doesn't need to look at it because, all right, so I'm gonna, right. Okay, good. So basically we're talking about, when we're talking about this annexation in this context, we're talking about the West Bank. Ever since Israel took the West Bank in 1967, they have colonized the territory. So they've set up Israeli colonies. Essentially, you see, you read about this in the media, everybody calls them settlements, but I like to call a spade a spade. They're colonies. So they have built Israeli-only cities all over the West Bank. All of these cities are, of course, built on stolen Palestinian land. And they have created all sorts of economic and other kind of incentives to encourage Jewish Israeli citizens to go live there, right? So all over the West Bank, and I'm dotted all over the place, you have these gigantic Israeli colonies that are built on stolen Palestinian land and on which no Palestinian can ever live. So the settlements, the colonies, you have them all over the place in the West Bank. And you have the Israeli military also posted all over the West Bank, mainly to protect the settlements, right? So this is one of the, besides being a blatant violation of international law, this is one of the practical problems that one has when you colonize in other people's territories, that you end up having to send your military there to protect the colonizers. And so this is one of the causes of the brutal oppression that you see all over the place in the West Bank. Everybody knows about the checkpoints and the extreme movement restrictions that you have all over the West Bank, only for Palestinians. They're very, very severe. But any kind of dissent, any kind of sort of opposition to the occupation is really dealt with a very sort of in a very brutal way. Any kind of protest, and what you have in the West Bank is really a situation of apartheid, because you have all these, you have these colonies all over the place. Israelis that live in the colonies, and they go, they drive in and out. They drive in between, quote unquote, Israel proper and the colonies. They do this all the time. We're not talking about a big country as a whole. And many of them have jobs in Jerusalem. They have, relatives in Tel Aviv, whatever. They're driving back and forth. But the point is, they live in the colonies, and any kind of situation that they are governed by Israeli civil law. So like if an Israeli settler were to break the law, then they would be arrested by the Israeli police. They would be afforded all the kind of rights that anybody would take for granted. They would have access to a lawyer. They would have the right to remain silent. They would generally be allowed bail, awaiting their trial, that kind of stuff. And then they would be tried in a civil court, right? But when you're Palestinian and you're living in the West Bank, you are basically the target of the Israeli military, right? So you're arrested by the Israeli military. You're hauled into trial under an Israeli military court with barely any of the kind of due process guarantees that Israeli settlers have. So there's this different laws for different people's situation, which is really can only be described with the word for apartheid. So you have this kind of situation, and really the colonies, again, they're dotted all over the West Bank. And what you have is a situation of what people have called for a long time de facto annexation. Basically, the entire territory of the West Bank is de facto already ruled by Israel. And there are, pockets of Area A and Area B where the Palestinian Authority, now the government of Palestine, has some semblance of autonomy where they can run schools and run hospitals and this kind of thing. But that's all done really at the pleasure of the Israelis. They have to even going between an area of autonomy, going from one Bandistan to another Bandistan, they have to cross all these checkpoints. They have to have special permits, all this kind of stuff. So really, you have a situation where it's already being ruled by the Israelis in every way, shape, or form. So that's what the situation is on the ground. But Israel has never taken the real final step of formally annexing the West Bank, aside from Jerusalem, and we can talk about that later. But it is ruled. It is allegedly a situation of occupation, military occupation, and that despite the fact that the situation of occupation in law is supposed to only last like a couple of years, it's been going on since '67. I mean, it's a situation of perpetual occupation where everything can be sort of left on hold and left in limbo. Israel's never taken this final step of formally announcing, look, this is our country, this is our land, and we're going to treat it as such. And the reason for that, I mean, there are a number of different reasons, including the international criticism that it might face, but really what it has to do with what kind of country Israel has always wanted itself to be. Israel is based, the state of Israel is based on, the ideal of Zionism. And Zionism is based on the idea of that, we have a state, basically, we have a state only of Jews, only for Jews, a Jewish and democratic state. Now, annexing the West Bank would necessarily mean that you're looking at, 2.5 million more Palestinians living within the state of Israel. And that presents Israel with a big choice, a big dilemma, because either they afford Palestinians equal rights, including the right to vote. And if they do that, then that means, at least in their perception, that sooner or later they would be voted out of power and basically the Palestinians would take over. Ergo, no more Jewish state, right? But at the same, so, the answer to that is, okay, then we annex, but we don't give the Palestinians civil rights. We don't give the Palestinians any rights at all. They're just underlings or slaves. But that flies in the face of this whole ideal that Israel likes to believe it was built on, of it being a democratic state and a beacon for all humanity. So this is the big dilemma that Israel has never really been able to face. And they've kept on, ever since '67, they kept on kicking the can down the road, just hoping that, somehow everything would go away. And it is really kind of funny because, again, for decades, the whole annexation debate was really very taboo. I mean, like, people just didn't want to talk about it, right? But then, and this was when I was there, so I remember this really clearly, it was just like one day, it was almost like the floodgates had opened. And you see in the Israeli media and Israeli newspapers and all this kind of stuff, all of a sudden there's this big public debate about annexation and maybe we should just go ahead and do it, and all this kind of debate. Again, they never really got together to actually do it. But it's been something which people have been talking about for a few years, for sure.
Surely this annexation cannot be legal, right? From what you've just said, surely it cannot be legal.
Yes, absolutely not. It is absolutely illegal in every way, shape, or form. And it is really important to stress that, because the entire international order that we have now is based on the principle that might does not make right? Because that's how it was before, up to World War I, maybe arguably World War II. Strong countries did what they want. The imperial powers, they just, they went abroad, they colonized other countries at will, they stole their resources, they stole their land, they stole their people, and that's just how it was. You know, might made right. And if you were strong enough to do that, well, you know, good for you. And the weaker, the countries, the peoples that were on the receiving end of the stick, well, that was just how it went, right? But you know, that the whole international order changed a little bit with the League of Nations, but certainly now what we have with the United Nations. You know, there's an understanding now that people have the right to self-determination, all peoples, and that imperialism and colonialism and you know, subjugation of any other peoples is just wrong. I mean, this is, you know, this flies in the face of the most fundamental principles of international law that we have now. So it is absolutely illegal. And, you know, it's not just a question of how much or when or all this kind of thing. It's just, it's wrong. It's unlawful. And annexation of any part of the West Bank really would fly in the face of this most fundamental international principle that we have.
Now, you spoke about de facto annexation. So this isn't the first time then, is it?
Well, it's not the first time that Israel has actually illegally annexed territory. So when they took East, again, like I said, in 48, from the time that the war had ended, they had their eye on the West Bank, and in particular, Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, that has the old city with all the holy religious sites. So, you know, for decades, they were dreaming of this and trying to figure out a way that that they could get the other side to start a war. In the end, they started the war themselves, so you know, it didn't really matter. But they took East Jerusalem in '67 and essentially applied Israeli law almost immediately. It wasn't until a little bit later that they formally announced that they annexed the territory. But you know, the point is that they did. So they have formally annexed East Jerusalem and also the Golan Heights, which they also took in '67, and which, you know, is another different part of contention. It's a very big point of contention, obviously, between the state of Israel and Syria. Now, with East Jerusalem and Golan Heights either, I mean, no country has recognized this. No country recognized the annexation of East Jerusalem, which is why, when I was there, no country had their embassy in Jerusalem, because it wasn't the capital of Israel, right? So all the countries, you know, a lot of countries in the world had embassies to the state of Israel, but they were never located in Jerusalem. They were in Tel Aviv, because Jerusalem was not recognized as the capital of Israel. And now, of course, that's we have one country at least which has recognized that, the United States under Donald Trump, and that's really been a big negative factor in this whole thing. But yes, so it's not the first time, but it would definitely in many ways be an even more of a game changer.
Now you brought in the factor of the Trump, the Donald,
yes,
right?
The Trump factor, yes, indeed.
Yes. Right. So is this partly why Israel's making the move now?
I definitely think so. I mean, I think that's pretty clear that Israel believes that they have the chance to do this now and to get away with it now while Trump is in office. I think another reason that they see that things are not looking so good for Trump, so that they might, you know, he might lose in November, inshallah. So let's see. But you know, so I believe that, you know, there's definitely a political calculation that they should try to get as many facts on the ground as they can while Trump is still in office. You know, one thing that, you know, Trump has obviously been terrible for Palestine in a different order of degree. So, you know, that's definitely, you know, important to stress. But it's also, you know, we must never recognize that, we must never forget that, you know, the US has always supported Israel, you know, extremely blatantly. They've acted as Israel's lawyer in the United Nations. The so-called peace process, you know, Oslo and everything, the whole thing, really the United States has pretended to be a neutral and fair broker, an honest broker, but they never have been. I mean, they have always sided with the Israelis. And that's, you know, that's something which has been the case for a long time. But at the same time, there was, in all fairness, there was a pretense. I mean, there was a pretense of being an honest broker, and there was, they had to do certain things to maintain that pretense. Nobody really believed that they were, you know, that they were really impartial, but they did, you know, at certain points in time, they did, you know, take certain measures against Israel. They did take certain positions which they felt they had to maintain at least the appearance of impartiality. But of course, Trump has completely decimated that and taken support to Israel at an utterly unprecedented heights. He's recognized Jerusalem as the capital, moved the embassy. Everybody knows all this because everybody is watching the news. He's cut off funding to UNRWA, the UN agency which exists to support Palestinian refugees. The list goes on. And then, of course, he published his so-called deal of the century, which is really a plan based on, it's an Israeli wish list where they would get to annex nearly the entire West Bank, and apartheid would basically be completely solidified. The plan, if anybody, I really don't recommend that anybody actually reads through this entire plan. I definitely don't recommend that anybody does it like after a big meal, because it would really get you sick. But it's if you want to get really angry, it's worth doing it. I mean, there's language about the Palestinians not being ready for a state of their own, and when they are ready, maybe we'll think about it. This blatantly colonialist kind of thinking, which permeates through this entire document and comes out very, very clear. It's blatant and really in your face, like everything Trump does, of course. But it's really bad, and it even talks about expelling Palestinians with Israeli citizenship from the state of Israel to these Bandistan. So which I'll talk a little bit about later, about 48 Palestinians. But it's hard to see how things could get any worse than this plan. The funny thing about it is that people on the really extreme right in Israel some of them don't accept the Trump plan because they think it doesn't go far enough. They're not happy with the recognition in the Trump plan of some quasi bogus state for the Palestinians. Even these Bandistans are too much for some of these Israeli settler leaders who just want a declaration of this whole thing, the whole part, all of the West Bank, this whole part of the land of Israel belonging to Israel, and no Palestinian state, and these people can just go and disappear. So it really is amazing. But yeah, getting back to your question, for sure, I mean, the whole Trump factor is definitely a key part of it.
I've been hearing quite a bit about how this spells the end of the two-state solution. Is it? And if that's the case, what does this mean for Palestinian self-determination?
Yes, well, indeed. Okay, so the two-state solution. So here's where I start getting really riled up here. But let me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show once again, if that's okay, the slide. Because here's where history, a little bit of a primer on history is kind of important. I'm going to do this. Okay, good. So I spoke a little bit before about 67 and the West Bank, which is land that the Israelis took in 1967. Now, I want to go before that. And if you look at the map on the far left, this is what Palestine looked like in terms of land ownership, right? So the Ottoman Empire had, of course, fallen apart in 1917. And ever since then, the Brits had been ruling Palestine as part of a League of Nations mandate. And they had gone sort of back and forth between blatantly favoring Zionist settlers to Palestine and being a little bit more impartial. But the point is, just before the Brits left, this is what Palestine looked like in terms of land ownership, the map on the far left. So the green is all Palestinian-owned land. I think we're looking at 90, I believe the percentage was 96, 97% of the land was owned by Palestinians. And really only these small white bits, which are so tiny, you might not even be able to see them on the screen. This was land that was owned by Zionist settlers that had been coming from Europe and, purchasing land and purchasing farming land and all that kind of stuff. So population-wise, because there were large urban areas like Tel Aviv, the population was something like 2/3 Palestinian, 1/3 Zionist settler. But the ownership of land, as you can see, was just completely, lopsided in favor of the Palestinians, right? So that's what, that was what the situation was in Palestine, just as the mandate was ending. Now, as more and more Zionist settlers started coming in, as more and more hardcore, very sort of hardcore Zionist settlers started coming in, and they were only, they would only hire other Zionists to work on their farms and all this kind of thing. And the more and more the Palestinians are feeling under pressure. More and more the Palestinians are realizing that the Brits are basically in cahoots with the Zionist settlers. More and more they see that their land is being taken from them. So there are more and more clashes. There was a large-scale rebellion by Palestinians in the 30s, and all this kind of thing is happening. And things just get worse and worse. In some areas, really, it's some people would say it was like a situation of civil war. I like to say it was a little bit more one-sided, because the Zionists were allowed to carry weapons by the Brits. They were allowed to create their own militias. They were allowed to pretty much do whatever they wanted. So really the ethnic cleansing of the land, of Palestinians from the land, was already starting in the late 40s. But there were clashes, there were casualties on both sides. There were, things were looking really bad. So what the Brits did was they basically threw it to the UN and said, look, the UN should come up with a solution. And after debates and commissions and heavy lobbying by Zionist organizations of international diplomats, the UN partition plan, and I know a lot of people have heard about this, the UN adopted a partition plan in 1947. It's important to understand that this was not like mandatory or anything. This was just like a suggestion on the part of the UN. This was just like an idea, a proposal that they gave. But as you can see, and this is the map, which is the second from the left, as you can see, basically the idea of the partition plan was, okay, Palestinians and Jewish people, they're just never going to get along. We shouldn't put them in one country. What we should do is we should divide the land, right? We should divide the land, and there will be two countries, one for each people, and then they will live side by side in peace and security. You've heard that before, I'm sure, because we're still talking about it, right? And in 47, this was the UN's idea of how the land could be divided up, right? Now, if you compare it with the map on the far left, you already see, certainly from the perspective of Palestinians, you already see, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? We own 96% of the land. And basically the UN in New York they're trotting over and they're telling us, well, why didn't you guys just divide it up half and half? Now, wait a minute here. This doesn't seem fair to me. And certainly, if it seems fair to anyone here, I think we have a bit of a problem. Also noticeable is that a lot of the good land, Haifa, Tel Aviv was mainly a Jewish city, but Jaffa was not, for sure. And a lot of the good land suitable for ports, suitable for trade, all given to what would be a Jewish country, to what would be like the state of Israel under this UN partition plan. So basically, you're looking at a very, very unfair idea here. But ever since the partition plan in 47, that's essentially what the international community has been aiming for. Two countries for two peoples, right? So a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, namely the state of Israel. Two separate countries living side and side, but in peace and security, in sort of humanly brotherhood, this kind of thing, right? So that's what the partition plan looked like in 47. Obviously, the Zionists announced they would accept the UN partition plan, because obviously they're getting half the country, whereas they only had almost nothing. They also knew that there was going to be a war, and they were preparing for the war. They had already started the ethnic cleansing of people, of Palestinians. They had started preparing for war. Weapons that had been used in World War II, surplus stuff, had been coming in clandestinely from Europe all throughout. So they were prepared. They knew what was going to happen. The Palestinians obviously rejected. They said, no way, how is this fair? And so that led to the 48 war. And in 48, and this is where we get to map number 3, so the second from the right, this is what the result of the 48 war was. And as you can see, the Israelis are already taking more than had been allocated to them under the partition plan, right? So they had already, they've taken more than the UN said that maybe they should be entitled to, which is too much already, right? So this was already the kind of situation. And so when, you remember what I said, that when the international community talks about Palestine, what they're referring to is the green parts and under the third map, so the map on the second to the right, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So this is what would look, this is what they're thinking about when they think about an independent Palestinian state. 22% of mandate Palestine. So going down from 96%, and then the UN proposal was like 48%. Now we're down to 22%. But hey, it's better than nothing, right? So the two-state solution is basically, it's an extension of this formula. The extension of this idea that we should divide the land, right? Somehow, somehow that it's fair that the Israelis should get at least half of the land. Now more than that, because again, the West Bank and Gaza comprise only 22% of mandate Palestine. So we're looking at far less than that. But what I'm saying is that the whole idea of the two-state solution is already based on a fundamental injustice. It's already based on theft of Palestinian land, and accepting that Palestinians who have had their land stolen and refugees have been expelled from their land and from their houses, prohibited from returning, that we should just sort of accept it, and we should just sort of say, okay, yeah, well, I guess that's just how it goes. So it's just this ongoing mantra that, oh, the two-state solution is the only solution, two-state solution is the only way forward. But we really do have to recognize that it's based on a fundamental injustice towards the Palestinian people. So that's, I'll stop with the slides there. Oh, I can't hear you, Azra.
I forgot to unmute myself. So the two-state
Right, okay.
solution is based on a flawed premise to begin with, right?
Right.
Yeah. So if this annexation goes through, what does this mean to the Palestinians on the ground? Because Israel can no longer claim that it's a land without people.
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, like I already mentioned, I mean, Palestinians in the West Bank have been living in a de facto apartheid situation since '67. So, there's been a lot of talk about how, hey, it's not really going to make that much of a difference. That's not really true. There was a very good article in, I believe it was in Haaretz a couple of weeks ago, written by a very prominent human rights lawyer and activist in Israel named Michael Sfard. And he pointed out that, in fact, it would make a difference and it would be really bad, because up till now, at least, again, there's this facade. There's a facade that Israel is only occupying Palestinian land temporarily. So this is governed by the laws of occupation, the international laws of occupation, which are based on the idea that it's a temporary occupation. There's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. Like you can't exploit natural resources for your own benefit. You can't, colonize the land. You can't expel people from the land. Now, as we all know, and as I've been saying, Israel's doing that anyway. So, they violate pretty much every principle you can imagine of the law of occupation in any case. But once again, there's a pretense. There's a pretense here that very rarely, but sometimes is upheld, for example, by the Israeli judiciary. Sometimes the Supreme Court, which has recognized it as being a state of occupation, says, look, under the law of occupation, this is a bit too much. Look, this is the kind of thing you can't really do. It's not enough, it's inadequate, but it does happen. And the whole pretense also internationally of it being a situation of occupation still does prevent Israel from openly going beyond certain lines at least. But if Israel were to annex it, then, for example, it could just say, it could just announce, we're taking this part of this land because it benefits the public being the Israeli public. So it is, it would be bad. I mean, it would make it, it would make it easier for Israel to justify the kind of things that they've been doing anyway. But, for sure, Palestinians live in an apartheid-like situation in any case. So in that regard, how much of a fundamental change it would make is sort of open to question. But still, it's important to stress that, it is extremely serious, because it's extremely serious for the Palestinian people, but it goes beyond that, because, like I said, the entire international order is based on the principle that, you can't do this. You don't just militarily take over somebody's land and say, now it's ours. The Iraqis did that in Kuwait, and look at what happened. The entire UN got together and banded together and kicked Iraq out. Right? The Russians did it with part of the Ukraine, and they've been living with sanctions ever since. So it is the fundamental principle of international law, and it's extremely important that it's upheld, because if we go back to a situation where might makes right, then once again the strong countries can do anything. The strong, it's like a return to the age of imperialism, and that's why this would be really, really, serious, not only in Palestine but internationally.
Now, there's been some visible international opposition to the plan for annexation. For example, you have the elders, former world leaders, issuing a statement, and parliamentarians across Europe. Could Israel be buckling a little bit under pressure and have a change of plans?
It's not really clear what's happening right now or what's going to happen. And actually from a pretty early stage, it was there was a lot of lack of clarity as to what exactly the plans would be. So we sort of just have to sort of wait and see. Certainly, the international pressure that's being brought on the Israelis is having an effect, I think, and it's a good thing. I mean, it's a positive thing that a lot of international actors, including a lot of governments, have spoken out against any kind of annexation, and they've told Israel quite clearly that it shouldn't go ahead, and there will be ramifications if it happens. But there is also, I think, a really clear danger on focusing only on this annexation issue, right? And this is something which Israel has proven itself very adept at playing. They announced that they're going to do something just horrendous, the end of the world. The whole world is up in arms and saying, no, you can't do it. That's too far. That's just too much. And then the Israelis, after a lot of sort of pushing and shoving and toing and froing, the Israelis say, maybe we'll just, maybe we'll just do a little bit. And that's what they're talking about now, that there would be a smaller scale annexation of some of the colonies. Maladumin mainly, which is a very big colony right close to East Jerusalem. So that is, it's I mean, certainly most Israelis don't even, they don't even recognize that it's a colony. It's part of Israel in their mind. So, they're talking about a very, very small scale annexation. So, and then they come up with this smaller, much lower level plan, and everybody's relieved. And everybody says, oh, yeah, okay, the pressure, oh, we're so glad that it would have been the end of the world. We're so glad. And then they turn to the Palestinians and say, look, now it's your turn to make some positive steps. It's your turn to reciprocate this, positive signal from the Israelis with some givings of your own. So it's a tool that we've seen, or it's a strategy that we've seen the Israelis use a lot throughout the years. Countless examples of this kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing that we really have to be careful of. Even if even if there was no annexation of the West Bank at this point, it remains the case that Palestinian rights are completely oppressed. The Palestinian people are completely oppressed. Palestinians' rights are violated. Every single internationally recognized human right is violated on a systemic and daily basis in occupied Palestine. And that's, that's really the main issue here. And it's not, is there annexation? How much annexation will there be? All this kind of thing. So we really have to make sure that we don't get distracted and we don't lose sight of the forest for the trees.
I was just going to ask you, do you see this as a red herring, as a distraction, this annexation plan?
Well, I don't know if I would call it a red herring or a distraction, because like I said, it is serious, and I do think that certainly many elements in the Israeli government want to do this. They want to push forward with doing it in some sort of way. And lest we forget, Trump has announced that he thinks it's a great idea. Trump has announced that the United States, under him at least, would recognize any kind of annexed territories as belonging to Israel. So there is certainly a push within the Israeli government and within political circles in Israel to do this and to do this now. And again, like I said, and like has been written by Michael Sfard and other people, it would be serious. I mean, it would have ramifications also beyond Palestine. But I just what I want to stress is that it's, this is not the by-all and end-all of what's happening in Palestine. Even if this annexation were canceled, Netanyahu announces, actually, we're not going to do it after all. We're still back at the status quo. We're still back at the situation where Palestinians live in a situation of apartheid, under an apartheid regime. And we've been talking about the annexation issue. Really, I've been focusing on the West Bank. But I do think it's important to stress that it's not just Palestinians that live in the West Bank that have this, that do have their human rights violated on a systemic basis. It's Palestinians everywhere, basically. We're looking at Palestinian refugees who are ethnically cleansed, from, expelled from their homes, kicked off of their land. They, to this day, are prohibited from returning to their homes in land that is basically that has been conquered by the Israelis. In blatant violation of the principle of right to return under international human rights law and international law. And once again, lest we forget, this was, resolution of the refugee issue was one of the conditions of Israel being admitted to the UN. So, this took place in, very soon after Israel, declared independence after the 48 war. So, this should have been sorted out by now, in accordance with human rights principles. So we have refugees, we have people who live, Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank, but because it was annexed by Israel, they live under Israeli law. These people have been living there for generations, and yet they are treated as foreigners. So like if I, as a Japanese citizen, I were to study in Israel in an Israeli university, I would be subject to immigration law like any foreigner, right? So that's how they're treated. There's no kind of special recognition of the fact that they've been living there for generations and this is their land. And if they, for example, go abroad to work or to live for over a certain period of time, they run the risk of having their residency permits revoked. And this happens, all the time. And it's happened over the years to thousands of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And then also I want to mention the situation of Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. There are about 1.8 million, almost 20% of the population of the state of Israel is in fact Palestinians. And these are people who basically were not expelled from their land in 48, right? So as the state of Israel was declared and they expelled 2/3 of the population, at least 2/3 of the population, Palestinian population, but the war ended quite quickly. They couldn't get around to expelling everybody. And it was also very problematic for them to expel entire populations of Christian cities like Nazareth, because these are cities, being Christian cities, Europeans are very conscious of what's going on there. So, basically they ended up having to leave a certain number of Palestinians there. Those Palestinians have stayed there by and large, and they've grown in proportion in the population to almost 20% of the population. So they have Israeli citizenship. And Israelis are always, the Israeli government is always sort of, holding them up as an example of what a wonderful democracy and, you know, how they respect human rights, that Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, they have equal individual rights and they're treated equally, and, you know, all this kind of stuff, which is decidedly not the case. They do have civil rights, they have the right to vote, and in a very sort of superficial way, yes, they go about their lives in you know, pretty much unmolested in all sorts of ways, on a daily superficial level. But because they are treated as a fifth column and are officially not recognized as having any kind of sort of self-determination type rights, they, for example, are not allowed to own land. I mean, that's a pretty stark example. So it's you know, it's just, you know, they too have their rights, are discriminated against in a systemic way and have their rights violated in a very systemic way. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that Palestinians everywhere they suffer from Israeli apartheid. They suffer from Israeli policies which discriminate against them, not because they live in the West Bank or just because of this kind of stuff, that they are terrorists from living in Tulkarem or wherever. No, by mere virtue of the fact of being Palestinian, they have their rights basically, you know, violated on a systemic basis. So, you know, this is really what we need to think about. And so that's why, you know, it's important to stress that annexation is not, you know, the be-all and end-all of what's going on.
All right, I'm just going to take some questions now, if it's all right with you, Saul. Yeah. So let's go to the UN, right? Many of us, many see UN as really just a toothless organization, but at the same time, we look towards it as a world governing body, right? So is there anything the UN can do, or is there anything we can expect it to do?
Well, this is a tricky question here. Oh dear. Well, the textbook answer, as you know, when I was working in the UN, I mean, nobody sat me down and told me this is the textbook answer when somebody asks you this, of course. But I can't, you know, you're socialized in an environment and in an organizational culture. So, you know, you know what you're supposed to say. And the textbook answer as a UN civil servant is that the UN is run by member states, and they set the agenda, they set the priorities, they decide on the policies, and they instruct us, humble civil servants, what to do. And, you know, we are but humble servants of the crown, so to speak, and we just, you know, we do what we're told, we do our jobs in an impartial and neutral manner. And, you know, that's true. I mean, for sure, the reason that the UN has been incapable of taking really strong, serious action on this is because of the Americans and because of their privileged position on the Security Council, being able to, you know, veto any kind of resolution that is even remotely critical of Israel. And what comes with that is not just their power on the Security Council. I mean, it really is, you know, being the major donor, being the major funder of most agencies. You know, they wield quite the overwhelming power in a lot of different ways. So, you know, it's not just the Americans, unfortunately. A lot of times the Europeans tend to be more talk and less action. And so it's just one of those issues that, you know, quite a lot of the powerful countries just don't want to get involved in. And that's very much, you know, it's very much true. At the same time, I do, you know, I don't want to detract, you know, I don't want to in any way detract from the fact that you know, the UN is very much ruled by member states and really has to, you know, abide by the positions that the member states take. But at the same time, it's also worth to point out that it's not quite that simple. So, like, for example, when the Secretary General briefs the Security Council, just think of, for example, the national context when the head of the civil service briefs the politicians. The way that, you know, the civil servant frames the issues, the options that they can present, you know, that really does have a certain amount of influence on the choices that member states can take. I'm not trying to say that, you know, the Secretary General is responsible for this and that, and, you know, it's his fault that, you know, the UN isn't doing this or that. I mean, even had he urged a stronger stance, the Americans probably wouldn't budge. But one of the big mistakes that the UN did was join the Quartet. The Quartet being, a separate international organization, or sort of bunch of sort of grouping of like-minded countries and international organizations that want to advance peace in Palestine. And the Quartet, unfortunately, is heavily influenced in many ways, not only by the Americans, but also by Israeli positions, in particular regarding the Hamas government in Gaza. So the UN, out of its own accord, joined the Quartet and is therefore bound by Quartet positions, meaning that it cannot have any kind of contact with Hamas, because Hamas is a terrorist organization, a bunch of mean people that don't want to play with the boys and girls in Israel whom we like. So that is a big mistake. That was a huge, huge mistake. And really, it's almost unheard of that the UN is in a conflict situation, yet is constrained and barred from speaking with all parties to the conflict. This is ridiculous. And I went to Gaza for my work. I did this all the time. And the torturous maneuvering that we had to do to avoid speaking with Hamas in a formal sense just made it almost impossible to do our work in a really sort of effective way. So, there's a lot that the UN could have and should do differently as well, besides just saying, well, it's the member states that dictate their policies to us.
One more question. So what can we do really? We're holding this webinar, we're talking, we're activists, we organize activities, but really what else can we do for Palestinian rights?
Well, I think I think already holding this webinar and, talking about these kind of things, holding these kind of events and doing this kind of activism it's already really important. I mean, it is really, it's important, and it's much more effective than I think a lot of people give ourselves credit for. I'll give an example of activism in universities in the United States. As you can see from my accent, I spent my childhood in the United States. I didn't go to university there, but I keep in touch, and I have American relatives, and I know a little bit about the place. But when I was growing up, the notion that there would be major events criticizing Israel, our ally, our great ally in the Middle East, it's just like, it was inconceivable. It's just like you couldn't conceive it. But now, in universities all over the country, they hold Israeli Apartheid Week, major events, speakers, activism, all that kind of stuff that student activists do, and this has made a big difference. I mean, it's really helped in changing the discourse to a certain extent in the United States, and the Israelis are so scared you couldn't imagine, and you can see just by the backlash that that has been taking place against activism in American universities. They've been trying to defund American universities who promote professors who take pro-Palestinian stances. Now the federal government is weighing in under Trump, saying that they will yank federal funds from universities that promote, where they have these kind of events. All this kind of stuff is taking place. It's very, very extreme, but it shows that they're scared. They see the writing on the wall. They see the public narrative in the United States shifting, that the public perception of Israel shifting, and that's something that really scares them. So doing this kind of activism is really important. It's far more effective than sometimes when we get depressed, we get sad. Of course, it happens to all of us, but it's far more effective than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. And lobbying the government, lobbying our elected representatives to take strong stances against Israel is really important. And that's it's really about the BDS movement, really. I mean, taking part in the BDS movement, which I know, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this webinar right now are already part of it, so you probably don't need me to introduce it. But it's a game changer. It's a game changer because it's an international civil society movement that was created by Palestinians, led by Palestinians, but it's global, it's international, and it hits the state of Israel where it really hurts. Because the comparisons, the parallels with what happened to South Africa are they're too clear to ignore. And it was the same with South Africa. At the beginning, the governments, they couldn't care less. But it was really civil society and the boycott movement that created this upswell, created this groundswell, upsurge of public opinion that the governments of the world just couldn't ignore at the end. And that's really what I think brought down, there are many different factors, but that's what brought down apartheid in South Africa. And I think it can also do the same here. One last thing I do want to say about, because I know this comes up a couple of times when I've spoken to Malaysia a few times about visiting Palestine. Obviously, Malaysia has no relations with the state of Israel, but I do understand that there are ways of doing this. There are tour companies. I don't know too much about it, but there are ways of doing this. And I know that this is, people have different opinions about this, whether it's a good thing, whether it's wrong. Obviously, I'm not Palestinian. I don't want to speak for the Palestinian people. I kind of think it's not a bad thing to go, but if you do go, what I would urge everybody is to go with knowledge of what's happening, with knowledge of the ethnic cleansing, of apartheid, of the human rights violations, and keep your eyes open to see what's going on. If you go, then don't go to Al-Aqsa and take selfies with IDF soldiers or border guard police and post things on Facebook saying, wow, Israel's a really clean and nice country. Because it's a lot of these tours, if they're connected to Israeli tour companies, which I gather many of them are, then they're going to show you, they're going to want you to come back to Malaysia with a really positive impression of Israel. They're going to hide the terrible things that are taking place, that they're doing, and just try to, show you a glossed over, whitewashed version. So, if you do go, please, don't take selfies with border guards and this kind of stuff. Keep your eyes open and see what's going on, and then come back and tell everybody what's going on. Come back and tell everybody the terrible thing that's going on. I do think it's a good thing that people see with their own eyes the brutal oppression that's taking place. Yes.
I would agree with that. I spent 1 month in Jerusalem and West Bank, and seeing with my own eyes is a whole lot impactful than reading or hearing someone talk about it. I've got one more question, then we wrap up. There seems to be a disconnect between many governments and its citizens. One would like to say that Western government and citizens, but today it's not just the Western governments, right? Citizens tend to support the Palestinian cause where governments don't. Why do you think this is so?
Well, I mean, look, the state of Israel has really done an amazing PR job in selling itself as the go-to place for securitization. So, I mean, this has been going on, of course, for a long time. It's not something which started with 9/11 and the global war on terror, but definitely it's accelerated since then, right? So, Israel is the model for all of these countries that want to fight terrorism, want to survey all their citizens, survey everybody in the territories, utter securitization of society as a whole. Really, Israel has sold itself as the place, the country that can be a great security consultant. Let's put it that way. And that, that's one of, that's certainly, I would argue, certainly one of the big aspects here. Like, if you just take my country, Japan, that's, one of the big reasons that our government has been trying to strengthen relations with Israel over the past 7, 8, 9, 10 years. One, they know that being on good terms, being on buddies with Israel means that Donald Trump and the Americans in general are going to like us even more. But also, Japan wants to buy weapons and wants to develop high-tech weapons and wants to, export weapons, wants to do all these kind of, very lucrative defense contracts. And Israel, again, has done a very effective job in selling itself and selling its weapons industry. It's a major exporter of weapons. I mean, people don't realize this, but it's like, globally, it's like the 5th or the 6th largest exporter of weapons. But when they do this, they sell their weapons industry. They sell their weapons as having been battle tested. So basically, they're using the West Bank and Gaza as a testing ground for their weapons. And then they perfect their weapons. They use them in combat or use them in counterinsurgency, use them in counterterrorism kind of stuff. And they sell those weapons on to all these other countries as well. So, that's also part of it. This whole the whole global war on terror, the whole march towards mass securitization of all issues in society, Israel has done an impressive job in creating a niche for itself and creating and positioning itself so it is looked at as, a positive force in this whole kind of thing. And lest we forget, global Islamophobia also has been, it's also part of the global war on terror. And Israel has, again, been able to sell itself as the outpost of Western civilization in the barbaric Middle East, fighting, Islamic terrorism. So again, the Americans, the Europeans, also my country, and a lot of countries, they're flocking to Israel to say, hey, this is really neat. How can we do this kind of stuff? So I think that's also, that is definitely part of it.
All right, that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Any last parting thoughts? Couple of minutes.
Well, I guess I'll just repeat myself in saying, don't be fooled by all the coverage, all the media coverage on annexation and all these, annexation is important, and it's important also for the international order in general. But the main issue here is the brutal oppression of the Palestinian people. And even if the Israelis don't go forward with annexation of the West Bank, that is not changing right now. So that's really what we have to address, and that's really what we have to work at changing as activists.
All right, Saul, thank you very much for a very enlightening evening. I really enjoyed the session. And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you again. Follow our Facebook page for regular updates on our next lecture in this series. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good evening and assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
نحمي قدس الكرامة حكم ترم بقدسي يخسى لا يظلم الأمريكان إيد بريدك نحمي الأقصى من فرعون ومن هامان حكم ترم بقدسي يخسى لا يظلم الأمريكان مسقط عماني ويا دمشق بلاد الشام القدس تصرخ حزناني بين اخواني كيف انضام عز القاهرة المصونة مع عز رجال الخرطوم من عز القدس الميمونة لازم لشل القدس نقوم يا نواكشوط صحموني ويا جزر القمر نهلي هاتي غضبة مروني حكم ترم الحرة الليبية مقديشو مع جيبوتي نادوا على القدس الفاتية يا قدسي لا تموتي. القدس تنادي تركيا وتنادي عز اسطنبول وتولى لمبور الحمية يا جاكرتا هاتي خيول ويا أمة نبينا بالأقصى وصلنا بيه فلسطين الحرة لينا للمسلم والعربي فيها الصهيوني راح يخسر